I've been a real estate lawyer for over 40 years. In all my time, I have never felt a greater need to issue a warning than I do right now. What I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core. There is a new kind of predator stalking our neighborhoods. They don't break down doors or smash windows. They are stealing homes, your homes, with nothing more than a pen, a notary stamp, and your personal information. So if you are a property owner, I need you to listen. There is a new deed fraud scheme spreading like wildfire across this country, and it is targeting you specifically because of your age and because you own your home. Let me tell you about a man named Harold Jennings. Harold is a retired postal worker, a grandfather, and until 6 months ago, the proud owner of a 3-bedroom house on Maple Street that he paid off 15 years ago. It was his life's work, his nest egg, his legacy. Today, according to the official county records, Harold Jennings is a tenant in his own home. The legal owner is a woman he has never met, who lives in a state he has never visited. How is that possible? That's the question everyone asks. Let me show you. This document was filed on March 15th of this year. It shows Harold Jennings voluntarily transferring ownership of his property to a stranger for the sum of $10. You can see Harold's signature right here at the bottom, and it's been properly notarized by a licensed notary public. It looks completely official. The problem is, Harold never signed this document. He never met the woman on this deed, and he certainly never agreed to sell his home for $10. The answer to how this happened is both simpler and more terrifying than you can imagine. And I am going to walk you through their playbook, step by step, because understanding how these criminals operate is the only way to protect yourself from becoming their next victim. It all starts with information. It's personal information that you think is private, but is actually scattered across dozens of public databases that anyone with a computer and a few dollars can access. The fraudsters start with public property tax records. They can go online right now and see your name, your address, what your home is worth, and most importantly, whether or not you have a mortgage. They are specifically looking for people like you, seniors who own their homes free and clear. People who are more likely to live alone and to be trusting of official-looking documents. They don't have to steal your mail to learn this. They learn it all from their laptops, treating your life's work like an item in a shopping catalog. Once they have their target, they need 3 things: a fake deed, a fake signature, and a real notary seal. Let's start with the deed. The fraudulent deed that stole Harold's home is identical to a legitimate one. Why? Because the blank forms are available for anyone to download from the county's own website. The criminals are using the exact same documents that I, a real estate attorney, use every day. They simply fill in the blanks. Your name as the seller, the name of a stranger as the buyer, and your property's legal description, which they copy directly from the tax records. They often use a nominal fee, like $10, because it suggests a family transfer and raises fewer red flags. Now I know what you're thinking. What about the signature? Surely a forged signature would be obvious. The hard truth is that signature verification at a busy county records office is largely a myth. The clerk who processes these deeds might handle 50 or 60 a day. They are not handwriting experts. They spend maybe 30 seconds on each document, checking that it's formatted correctly and that it has what appears to be a real notary seal. And the forgeries themselves are terrifyingly accurate. This isn't someone practicing your signature with a pen. These criminals use high-quality scanners and software. They can lift a sample of your signature from a public document, a scanned check from your bank, or a petition you signed and reproduce it perfectly. Harold himself said that when the police showed him the forgery, he wasn't immediately sure that it wasn't his own. But the most crucial and insidious part of this entire scheme is the notary seal. This is what makes the whole thing work. The seal on Harold's fraudulent deed is real. It belongs to a licensed, legitimate notary public named Patricia Chen. She has been a notary for 18 years and has a spotless record. She also never notarized Harold's signature on this document. So, did someone steal her equipment? Number. What they did was far more clever. The criminals went to Patricia with a completely different legitimate document, maybe a simple affidavit or a power of attorney. Patricia did her job perfectly. She checked the signer's ID and applied her official seal. The fraudsters then went back to their office, used high-end scanning technology to digitally lift that real notary seal from the legitimate document, and then printed it onto the fake deed for Harold's house. To the county clerk, it looks perfect. It has the correct name, the correct commission number, and the distinctive raised impression. The seal is real. It's just on the wrong document. Do you see how terrifying this is? With this technique, any document can be made to look official. Now let's look at what happened to Harold. The fake deed was filed on March 15th. The law requires that the county notify the property owner of any transfer. But the criminals were one step ahead. They had already filed a change of address form with the post office, redirecting Harold's mail to a private mailbox in a different town. Harold had no idea any of this was happening until May 3rd, when a lawyer served him with eviction papers. He thought it was a mistake. He called the lawyer and explained that he owned the house, that he'd lived there for 32 years. The lawyer was polite, but firm. He said that according to the official county records, his client was the new owner, and Harold was now a tenant who had to leave. Harold did what any of us would do. He went to the county clerk's office with his original deed from 1991 to clear up the error. The clerk pulled up the records, looked at Harold's original deed, and then at the new one from March. She explained that the March deed legally superseded the old one. In the eyes of the law, Harold Jennings was no longer the owner of his home. Now there are ways to fight this. Deed fraud is a crime, and fraudulent transfers can be reversed in court. That's the good news. The bad news is that the process can take months or even years and can be financially devastating. Harold has already spent over $12,000 in legal fees just to stop the eviction and begin the long process of proving he is the rightful owner of the home he already owns. For many seniors on a fixed income, that cost alone is ruinous. Harold stood up slowly, his arthritis making the movement obviously painful. "I want to tell them about Elena," he said to Margaret. "I want them to understand what we're really dealing with." Margaret nodded and handed Harold the wireless microphone. His hand shook slightly as he adjusted it, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to confront the existence of evil in a way he had never imagined possible. "3 weeks after I filed my police report," Harold began, "Detective Morrison called me with an update on the investigation. They had tracked down Elena Vasquez, the woman whose name was on the deed transfer. She's a 34-year-old single mother who works as a home health aide in Phoenix, Arizona. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment and drives a 12-year-old Honda Civic. She has never been to Illinois, has never heard of me or my street, and was as shocked as anyone to learn that she supposedly owned a house in Chicago." The silence in the community center was now complete. Even the heating system seemed to have stopped its mechanical wheeze, leaving only the sound of Harold's voice and the occasional creak of folding chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. "Elena is a victim too," Harold continued. "Someone stole her identity the same way they stole my property. They probably got her personal information from a data breach, or maybe from something as simple as a job application she filled out online. They used her name and social security number to create the false identity of a property buyer, knowing that she would be too far away and too busy with her own life to realize what was happening until it was too late." Margaret took the microphone back from Harold and clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of the United States with red dots marking locations where similar deed fraud cases had been reported. The dots were everywhere, concentrated heavily in major metropolitan areas like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, but scattered across smaller cities and rural counties as well.
The map looked like the visualization of an epidemic, which in many ways it was. Harold and Elena's case is not unique, Margaret said. In Cook County alone, we've identified over 300 similar cases in the past 18 months. The pattern is always the same. Elderly property owner, home-owned, free and clear, fake deed transfer to a victim whose identity has been stolen, legitimate-looking notary seal that has been digitally manipulated. The fraudsters aren't even trying to hide their methods anymore, because they've discovered that the system isn't equipped to detect this kind of fraud quickly enough to matter. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a nondescript office building in what looked like a generic business park. This building in Schaumburg houses 17 different limited liability companies, all registered within the past 2 years, all claiming to be involved in real estate investment or property management. The Illinois Secretary of State's office shows that these companies have filed over 800 property transfer documents in the past year alone. When investigators tried to contact the companies, they found that most of the addresses were mail drops. Most of the phone numbers were disconnected, and most of the principals listed on the incorporation documents were using stolen identities. The scope of what Margaret was describing began to dawn on her audience. This wasn't a few isolated criminals taking advantage of vulnerable seniors. This was an organized, systematic operation that treated property theft like any other business venture, complete with registered companies, professional documentation, and what appeared to be a well-developed understanding of the legal and administrative systems they were exploiting. The most disturbing aspect of this scheme, Margaret continued, is how perfectly it exploits the intersection of modern technology and outdated bureaucratic processes. County records offices have digitized their filing systems, which makes it easier for legitimate property transfers to be processed quickly and efficiently. But the same systems that allow a real estate closing to be completed in 30 minutes also allow fraudulent deed transfers to be filed just as quickly, with just as little scrutiny. She advanced to a slide showing side-by-side images of 2 deed transfer documents, one legitimate, one fraudulent. To an untrained eye, they were indistinguishable. Same forms, same language, same official seals, same processing stamps from the county clerk's office. The people processing these documents are not detectives, Margaret said. They're clerks doing administrative work, and they have neither the time nor the training to investigate whether each transfer represents a legitimate transaction. They're checking boxes on a form, not conducting fraud investigations. A man in the back row raised his hand. "What about the real estate agents?" he asked. "Wouldn't they be involved in a property sale like this?" Margaret shook her head. "That's one of the most insidious aspects of this fraud. It bypasses all of the traditional safeguards that exist in normal property transfers. When you sell your house through a real estate agent, there are multiple parties involved who have both the expertise and the financial incentive to make sure the transaction is legitimate. The agent wants their commission, the title company wants to avoid liability, the mortgage lender wants to protect their collateral. Everyone involved has a reason to verify identities, check documentation, and ensure that the seller actually owns the property they're selling." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a simplified flowchart of a normal property sale versus the deed fraud process. But quitclaim deeds can be filed by anyone, without any third-party involvement. If I wanted to transfer my property to my daughter, I could fill out the form myself, have the signature notarized at any UPS store, and file it at the county office for a $25 fee. No real estate agent, no title company, no attorney required. It's designed to make legitimate family transfers simple and inexpensive, but it creates a loophole that fraudsters can drive a truck through. The temperature in the room seemed to be rising, and Margaret noticed that several people were removing sweaters or jackets. The weight of the information she was presenting was beginning to create a physical sense of claustrophobia, as if the walls of their financial security were closing in around them. "Let me tell you about Dorothy Martinez," Margaret said, advancing to a slide that showed a modest 2-story house with a well-maintained garden and an American flag hanging from the front porch. Dorothy is 81 years old, a retired nurse who bought this house in Cicero in 1976 for $18,000. She finished paying off the mortgage in 1994 and has been living on her Social Security and a small pension ever since. The next slide showed Dorothy herself, a small, dignified woman with silver hair and bright eyes, wearing a floral dress and holding what appeared to be a legal document. 3 months ago, Dorothy received a letter from a property management company informing her that her house had been sold and that she needed to begin paying rent of $800 per month to remain in residence. When Dorothy protested that she owned the house, the management company showed her a deed transfer dated 6 weeks earlier, showing that she had sold the property to an investment company called Midwestern Holdings LLC for $1,500. The gasps from the audience were audible now. Even in the context of Harold's story, the idea of stealing an $80,000 house for $1,500 struck everyone as particularly brazen and cruel. Dorothy called the phone number listed on the deed transfer document, Margaret continued. The person who answered identified himself as Marcus Williams, the managing partner of Midwestern Holdings. He was very sympathetic to Dorothy's confusion, he said, but business was business. The deed was properly filed and notarized. Dorothy's signature was on the document, and the $1,500 payment had been sent to Dorothy's address by certified mail. If Dorothy had somehow misplaced or forgotten about the transaction, that was unfortunate, but it didn't change the legal reality that she no longer owned the house. Margaret clicked to the next slide, which showed a certified mail receipt and a money order stub. The fraudsters had actually sent $1,500 to Dorothy's address, using a fake name and return address. When Dorothy wasn't home to sign for the certified mail, it was returned to sender, which created a paper trail suggesting that Dorothy had refused to accept payment for the house she had supposedly agreed to sell. The sophistication of this detail sent another wave of unease through the audience. The fraudsters weren't just filing fake documents. They were creating elaborate paper trails designed to make their victims look confused, forgetful, or dishonest. They were anticipating that their crimes would eventually be discovered and investigated, and they were taking steps to make sure that initial investigations would focus on the victim's credibility rather than the legitimacy of the transactions. Dorothy's case illustrates another disturbing trend, Margaret said. The fraudsters are no longer content to simply steal properties and disappear. They're setting up rental schemes, property management companies, and even legitimate-looking businesses designed to extract ongoing revenue from the properties they've stolen. Dorothy's house is now listed on Craigslist for rent at $1,200 per month, and the listing includes professional photographs and a detailed property description. She advanced to a slide showing a screenshot of the rental listing, complete with multiple photos of Dorothy's living room, kitchen, and bedrooms. These photographs were taken without Dorothy's knowledge or consent, probably by someone posing as a utility worker, inspector, or service technician. The listing describes the property as recently acquired by an investment company specializing in rental properties for seniors, and includes testimonials from supposedly satisfied tenants praising the company's professionalism and attention to tenant needs. The brazenness of using stolen photographs to rent out a stolen house was almost incomprehensible to many people in the room. They were beginning to understand that they were dealing with criminals who operated with the confidence and infrastructure of legitimate businesses, who maintained websites and phone numbers and professional-looking documentation, who probably kept regular business hours and filed tax returns and maintained liability insurance. Harold spoke up again from his seat in the third row. "I want to tell them about the others," he said to Margaret. "I want them to know they're not alone in this." Margaret nodded and handed him the microphone again. Harold stood more easily this time, as if the act of speaking about his experience was somehow strengthening him. "Since my story started getting attention in the newspapers," Harold said, "I've been contacted by 43 other people in the Chicago area who are dealing with the same thing. 43 people whose houses have been stolen through fake deed transfers. The youngest is 57, the oldest is 91. All of them owned their homes free and clear. All of them are facing legal bills they can't afford to prove that they own property they've lived in for decades." He paused, collecting his thoughts, and when he continued, his voice was stronger. "We've started meeting once a week at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on Roosevelt Road. We call ourselves the Stolen Home Support Group, and we share information about attorneys, court procedures, and strategies for dealing with the bureaucratic nightmare that this fraud creates. But mostly we remind each other that we're not crazy, we're not confused, and we're not alone." The idea of a support group for victims of property theft was both heartening and deeply sad. These were people who should have been spending their retirement years enjoying the security of paid-off mortgages and stable housing, not learning the intricacies of civil litigation and criminal investigation procedures. Margaret took the microphone back from Harold and clicked to a slide showing contact information for various legal aid organizations, consumer protection agencies, and law enforcement units. "If you think you might be a victim of deed fraud," she said, "or if you receive any suspicious documentation related to your property, there are resources available to help you. But I want to be completely honest about something. The legal system is not equipped to handle the volume of these cases, and the process of recovering stolen property can be financially and emotionally devastating even when you ultimately win." She advanced to the next slide, which showed a bar chart comparing the number of reported deed fraud cases to the number of cases that had been successfully prosecuted. The disparity was stark: thousands of reported cases, dozens of prosecutions, and only a handful of convictions that had resulted in significant jail time for the perpetrators. "The reality is that most of the people committing these crimes will never be caught," Margaret said. "They operate across state lines using stolen identities, working through shell companies that can be dissolved and recreated at will. Even when law enforcement identifies the individuals involved, extradition and prosecution across multiple jurisdictions is complicated and expensive. The financial incentives favor the criminals. They can steal hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property with relatively little risk of serious consequences." The futility of the situation was beginning to weigh heavily on the room. These were people who had grown up believing that hard work and following the rules would protect them, that their homes represented security that couldn't be taken away as long as they paid their taxes and maintained their properties. The idea that their most valuable assets could be stolen with forged paperwork, and that the legal system offered little realistic hope of recovery, challenged fundamental assumptions about justice and security in America. Margaret clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a handsome, professional-looking man in his 30s, wearing an expensive suit and standing in front of a luxury car. "This is David Chen," she said. "No relation to Patricia Chen, the notary whose seal was compromised in Harold's case. David is 28 years old, holds a degree in business administration from a respected university, and until 6 months ago was the regional coordinator for a deed fraud operation that stole over $40 million worth of property across 7 states. The next slide showed the same man, but now he was wearing an orange jumpsuit and standing against the height markers of a police booking photograph. David was arrested in May as part of a joint FBI and Secret Service operation called Stolen Foundation. He is currently serving a 15-year federal sentence for mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. During his interrogation, he provided detailed information about how these operations work, and his testimony is the source of much of what we know about the mechanics of deed fraud. Margaret paused, allowing the room to absorb the image of David Chen's transformation from successful criminal to convicted felon. According to David's testimony, he became involved in deed fraud, not because he was a career criminal, but because he was recruited by people who presented it as a legitimate real estate investment strategy. He was told that they were identifying undervalued properties owned by elderly people who would be better off in assisted living facilities, and that they were providing those people with cash buyouts that allowed them to transition to appropriate housing while freeing up valuable real estate for productive use. The manipulation implicit in this recruiting pitch was chilling. David Chen had apparently convinced himself that he was providing a service to elderly property owners, that he was helping them liquidate assets that had become burdensome. The fraudsters had created not just fake documents, but a fake moral framework that allowed their accomplices to sleep at night. David's job was to identify target properties and coordinate the document preparation, Margaret continued. He would spend his days reviewing public records, looking for properties that met their criteria: owned free and clear elderly owners, modest neighborhoods where a stolen property might not attract immediate attention. He used legitimate real estate software and databases, the same tools that legitimate investors use to identify potential acquisitions. She advanced to the next slide, which showed a screenshot of a spreadsheet containing hundreds of property addresses, owner names, ages, and assessed values. This is David's target list for Cook County. Each row represents someone's home, someone's life savings, someone's intended legacy to their children and grandchildren. David processed this information like any other business data, ranking properties by probability of successful theft and potential profit margin. The dehumanization of the victims was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of David Chen's testimony. These criminals weren't targeting strangers in moments of passion or desperation. They were systematically cataloging the assets of elderly property owners and treating those assets like inventory in a warehouse. Once David identified a target property, Margaret said, he would pass the information to a document preparation team that specialized in creating fraudulent deeds. This team included a graphic designer who had previously worked for a legitimate title company, a former paralegal who understood the technical requirements for property transfers, and a network of people who provided stolen identities to serve as fake buyers. The next slide showed samples of the fraudulent documents that David's team had created. Deeds, affidavits, powers of attorney, even fake death certificates that were used to transfer properties from deceased owners to fictitious heirs. The quality of the forgeries was remarkable, indistinguishable from legitimate documents without detailed forensic analysis. The stolen identities came from multiple sources, Margaret continued. Data breaches at major retailers and healthcare providers, information harvested from social media profiles, details purchased from corrupt employees at government agencies. In some cases, they created completely fictitious identities using fake social security numbers and fabricated personal histories. The fake buyers often lived in other states, making it difficult for victims to track them down and almost impossible for local law enforcement to investigate effectively. She clicked to a slide showing a map with lines connecting various cities across the Midwest and South. David's operation was truly national in scope. Properties were stolen in Illinois, but the fake buyers lived in Arizona, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. The money was laundered through accounts in Delaware and Nevada. The shell companies were incorporated in states with minimal disclosure requirements. Even the computer servers used to store the fraudulent documents were located overseas, making them virtually impossible for domestic law enforcement to access. The complexity and geographic scope of the operation was overwhelming. These weren't local criminals taking advantage of neighborhood vulnerabilities. They were sophisticated operations with the resources and expertise to operate across multiple jurisdictions and legal systems. Margaret advanced to a slide showing David Chen's financial records, which revealed the shocking profitability of deed fraud. In the 18 months before his arrest, David personally earned over $2 million from stolen properties. This wasn't his only source of income. He also received commissions from legitimate real estate transactions that he arranged using information gathered during his fraudulent activities. He owned 3 luxury cars, a condominium in downtown Chicago, and a vacation home in Wisconsin. He filed tax returns reporting his income as consulting fees from real estate investment companies. The idea that someone could earn millions of dollars by stealing homes from elderly people and then pay taxes on that income as if it were legitimate business revenue added another layer of surreal audacity to the crime. David Chen had apparently lived openly as a successful young businessman, attending charity events and networking functions, building relationships with legitimate real estate professionals who had no idea that his wealth came from systematic property theft. David's testimony revealed something else that I find particularly troubling, Margaret said, advancing to a slide that showed a photograph of a luxury hotel ballroom filled with well-dressed people at what appeared to be a professional conference. This is the National Real Estate Investment Summit, held last year in Las Vegas. David attended this conference not as a criminal trying to hide his illegal activities, but as a legitimate participant in workshops on property acquisition strategies, tax minimization techniques, and portfolio diversification methods. She clicked to the next slide, which showed David Chen standing with a group of other young men in expensive suits, all holding drinks and smiling at the camera. According to David's testimony, he met at least 12 other people involved in deed fraud operations at this conference. They didn't discuss their illegal activities openly, but they recognized each other through coded conversations about alternative acquisition strategies and non-traditional property transfers. They exchanged business cards, made dinner reservations together, and maintained ongoing professional relationships. The idea that deed fraud had become so common and profitable that its practitioners were networking at legitimate industry conferences was deeply disturbing. It suggested that property theft had evolved from isolated criminal activity into something approaching an organized industry, complete with professional development opportunities and peer mentorship programs. Margaret clicked to a slide showing David Chen's arrest photograph alongside photos of 6 other men in similar orange jumpsuits. Operation Stolen Foundation ultimately arrested 23 people across 7 states, she said. In addition to David Chen, the defendants included 2 former title company employees, a retired bank loan officer, 3 licensed notaries who had participated in document fraud, and multiple individuals who had provided stolen identities and fake identification documents. She paused, looking out at the faces in the community center. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to a kind of grim fascination, as if the audience was watching a documentary about a disaster that had happened to someone else, somewhere else, at some other time. But Margaret knew that for many of the people in that room, this disaster was not distant at all. The successful prosecution of David Chen's operation was a significant victory for law enforcement, Margaret said, but it also revealed the true scope of the problem we're facing. During the investigation, FBI agents identified over 800 properties that had been stolen through fraudulent deed transfers, with a combined value of more than $40 million. Most of the victims were elderly property owners who had worked their entire lives to pay off their mortgages, people just like everyone in this room. She advanced to a slide showing a complex organizational chart that looked like something from a corporate training manual, except that every position in the hierarchy represented a different role in a criminal conspiracy. What Operation Stolen Foundation revealed is that deed fraud is no longer the work of individual scammers or small criminal groups. We're dealing with sophisticated criminal organizations that operate like businesses, complete with management structures, quality control processes, customer service protocols, and even employee training programs. The next slide showed a screenshot from what appeared to be an internal training video, featuring a professional-looking woman in business attire standing in front of a whiteboard covered with diagrams and bullet points. This is Sarah Martinez, a former real estate attorney who created training materials for deed fraud operations. Her videos taught new recruits how to identify vulnerable properties, how to forge documents convincingly, how to manipulate notary services, and how to avoid detection by law enforcement. She charged $5,000 for her complete training package, and she had over 300 students before her arrest. The professionalization of property theft was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Margaret's presentation. These criminals had created educational resources, performance metrics, and career advancement opportunities around the systematic victimization of elderly property owners. They had taken something as fundamentally evil as stealing someone's home and turned it into a business model with training manuals and customer testimonials. Sarah's training materials included detailed instructions on psychological manipulation techniques, Margaret continued, showing a slide with bullet points that looked like something from a sales training seminar. Build rapport through shared experiences, express concern for the victim's welfare, create urgency through artificial deadlines, use official-sounding language to establish credibility, always present the fraud as a solution to the victim's problems. The audience shifted uncomfortably as they recognized tactics that had probably been used on them in various contexts throughout their lives, by telemarketers, door-to-door salespeople, and even some legitimate businesses. The difference was that Sarah Martinez had weaponized these techniques specifically to facilitate property theft from vulnerable seniors. Margaret advanced to the next slide, which showed a transcript from one of Sarah's training sessions. This is an excerpt from a role-playing exercise where Sarah's students practiced approaching elderly property owners, she said. The scenario involves a student pretending to be a representative from a home improvement company who has noticed that the target's roof needs repair. The student is supposed to gain access to the property, take photographs for future use, and gather personal information that can be used to forge documents later. She read from the transcript in a voice that mimicked the friendly, concerned tone that the fraudsters had been trained to use. "Mrs. Johnson, I was driving through the neighborhood and couldn't help but notice that your roof has some loose shingles that could become dangerous in the next storm. I represent a company that specializes in helping seniors maintain their homes safely and affordably. Would you mind if I took a few quick photographs so our estimator can provide you with a no-obligation assessment?" The simplicity and apparent reasonableness of the approach was unsettling. Every person in the room could imagine themselves responding positively to such a request, especially if it came from someone who appeared professional and genuinely concerned about their safety. "According to Sarah's training materials," Margaret continued, "this initial contact serves multiple purposes. The photographs provide detailed documentation of the property's condition and layout, which can be useful for creating rental listings later. The conversation allows the fraudster to assess the owner's mental state, living situation, and potential vulnerability. And the business card or brochure left behind provides a seemingly legitimate explanation for why the fraudster was at the property if anyone asks questions later." She clicked to the next slide, which showed actual photographs that had been taken during these reconnaissance visits. Images of roofs, siding, driveways, and landscaping that had been stored in digital files alongside property records and personal information about the owners. The fraudsters maintained detailed databases on their targets, Margaret said. They knew who lived alone, who had family members nearby, who seemed confused or forgetful, who was dealing with health problems or financial difficulties. This information helped them time their document fraud for maximum effectiveness. The systematic nature of the intelligence gathering was becoming clear to the audience. These weren't opportunistic crimes committed by people who happened upon vulnerable victims. They were carefully planned operations that involved months of research and preparation for each target property. Margaret advanced to a slide showing a calendar marked with dates and property addresses. David Chen's testimony revealed that his organization had learned to time their deed fraud around predictable life events, she said. Properties were often stolen shortly after the death of a spouse, when the surviving owner might be distracted by grief and less likely to notice mail redirection or unusual documents. They also targeted properties during tax season, when elderly owners might be confused by the volume of official mail they were receiving. The calculation and cruelty of preying on people during moments of personal crisis struck the audience like a physical blow. Many of the people in the room had experienced the death of a spouse or were currently caring for partners with serious health problems. The idea that criminals were monitoring obituaries and hospital records to identify opportunities for property theft added a new dimension of violation to an already traumatic experience. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sarah Martinez's training program, Margaret said, was her emphasis on creating long-term relationships with victims even after their properties had been stolen. She clicked to a slide showing what appeared to be a customer service script. The training materials included detailed instructions on how to maintain contact with victims after the deed fraud had been completed, offering assistance with housing transitions, connecting them with social services, even helping them find rental properties. She read from the script. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand this transition has been difficult for you, but I want you to know that our company is committed to making sure you're taken care of. We've identified several lovely senior living communities that would be perfect for someone with your needs, and we'd be happy to help you with the application process. We can even provide references and help with the security deposit if needed." The twisted logic of providing customer service to victims of property theft was almost incomprehensible. The fraudsters had apparently convinced themselves that they were helping their victims by stealing their homes and then assisting with the resulting housing crisis they had created. Margaret looked out at the sea of troubled faces before her and realized that she had perhaps pushed her audience as far as their emotional resilience could handle for one session. The weight of information about the sophistication, scope, and cruelty of deed fraud was beginning to show in slumped shoulders, worried expressions, and the kind of fidgeting that suggested people were ready to flee from what they were hearing. "I know this is overwhelming," she said gently. And I know it's frightening to learn that something you've always taken for granted, the security of property ownership, can be so easily compromised. But I want to shift our focus now from the problem to the solutions, because there are concrete steps you can take to protect yourself and your property. She clicked to a slide titled Protection Strategies, and the visible relief in the room was palpable. People sat up straighter, pulled out pens and notebooks, and focused their attention with the intensity of students preparing for a final exam. The first and most important step, Margaret said, is to monitor your property records regularly. Most county clerk offices now provide online access to property records, and you should be checking your property's ownership status at least once every 3 months. Look for any deed transfers, liens, or other documents that have been filed against your property without your knowledge. She showed a slide with step-by-step instructions for accessing online property records, complete with screenshots of the Cook County Clerk's website and examples of the information that property owners should be reviewing. This process takes about 5 minutes and costs nothing, Margaret said. If you're not comfortable using a computer, ask a family member or friend to help you set up regular monitoring, or contact your local senior center. Many of them now offer computer literacy programs specifically designed to help seniors protect themselves from various types of fraud. The practicality of this advice seemed to energize the audience. After hearing about the sophisticated criminal operations they were facing, the suggestion that they could fight back with something as simple as regular website monitoring felt empowering rather than overwhelming. The second critical protection strategy, Margaret continued, is to sign up for address monitoring with the Postal Service. The fraudsters almost always file change of address forms to redirect your mail before they submit fraudulent deed transfers, because they don't want you to receive notification of the property transfer until it's too late to stop it easily. She showed a slide with information about the Postal Service's premium address monitoring service. For a small monthly fee, the Postal Service will notify you immediately if anyone attempts to file a change of address form for your address. You'll receive both email and text message alerts within hours of any filing, which gives you time to contact the Postal Service and cancel the fraudulent address change before your mail gets redirected. A woman in the middle of the room raised her hand. "What if we don't use email or text messages?" she asked. "Some of us still prefer to handle things by mail and telephone." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "The Postal Service also offers telephone-based monitoring services," she said. "You can register a phone number to receive automated calls whenever there's any activity on your address. The system will call you immediately and provide a number to call back for more information. It's specifically designed for people who aren't comfortable with electronic communications." She advanced to the next slide, which showed contact information for various credit monitoring and identity theft protection services. "The third protection strategy is comprehensive identity monitoring," Margaret said. "Remember that deed fraud requires not just your property information, which is public record, but also your personal information, social security number, date of birth, signatures from checks or other documents. Identity monitoring services can alert you if your personal information is being used to open new accounts, file legal documents, or make major purchases." The slide included a comparison chart showing the features and costs of different identity monitoring services, with particular emphasis on services that monitored legal document filings and property transfers. "Some of these services are free," Margaret said, "and others cost less than what most people spend on cable television each month. Given what we know about the financial and emotional cost of recovering from deed fraud, this is probably the best insurance investment most property owners can make." Harold spoke up from his seat in the third row. "I want to tell them about the warning signs," he said. "The things I wish I had paid attention to before it was too late." Margaret handed him the microphone again, and Harold stood with more confidence than he had shown earlier in the presentation. The act of sharing his story seemed to be transforming him from a victim into an educator, someone whose painful experience could help others avoid similar trauma. "About 2 months before the fake deed was filed," Harold said, "I started getting phone calls from people asking about selling my house. Real estate agents, investors, companies that claim to specialize in helping seniors liquidate their assets. At first I thought it was just coincidence, maybe something to do with the market getting better. But looking back, I think those calls were part of the research process." He paused, collecting his thoughts. The callers were very professional, very friendly. They said things like, "We've noticed that your neighborhood is becoming very desirable, and we wanted to reach out in case you ever considered selling." They asked questions about whether I still had a mortgage, whether I was planning to downsize, whether I had family in the area. I thought they were just fishing for potential business. But I think they were actually gathering intelligence. Margaret nodded and clicked to a slide showing statistics about the volume of unsolicited real estate calls received by elderly property owners in targeted neighborhoods. "Harold's experience is very common," she said. "According to FBI data, most deed fraud victims report receiving multiple unsolicited contacts from real estate professionals in the months leading up to the property theft. These contacts serve two purposes. They help the fraudsters gather information about the property owner's situation, and they help establish a paper trail suggesting that the owner was actively considering selling their property." She advanced to the next slide, which showed examples of legitimate-looking business cards, brochures, and letters that had been used by fraudsters to make contact with potential victims. "The materials look completely professional," Margaret said, "because in many cases they are professional materials that have been stolen from legitimate real estate companies and modified with fake contact information. The fraudsters understand that elderly property owners are more likely to respond to approaches that look official and established." Harold continued with his story. "About 6 weeks before the deed fraud, I started getting mail from companies offering to help me with property tax assessments, home maintenance services, and something called estate planning optimization. The letters looked official, with company logos and professional letterhead. Some of them included forms asking me to verify my property information for their records." Margaret clicked to a slide showing examples of these solicitation letters. "These communications serve multiple purposes," she said. "They provide additional opportunities to gather personal information that can be used in document forgery. They help establish the fraudster's credibility, if the victim calls the phone numbers on the letterhead, and they create documentation suggesting that the property owner was actively seeking assistance with property-related issues." She advanced to the next slide, which showed a checklist titled "Red Flag Warning Signs." "If you're receiving multiple unsolicited contacts about your property, especially if they're coming from different companies, but asking similar questions, that's a significant warning sign that you may be being targeted for deed fraud. Other warning signs include receiving official-looking documents asking you to verify property information you never requested, getting calls from people who seem to know specific details about your property or personal situation, and discovering that your mail delivery has become irregular or unreliable." A man near the back of the room raised his hand. "What should we do if we recognize these warning signs?" he asked. "Who should we call?" Margaret advanced to a slide showing contact information for multiple agencies. "Your first call should be to your local police department," she said. "Even if they can't take immediate action, you want to create a paper trail documenting your concerns. Ask for a report number and keep a record of when you called and who you spoke with. Your second call should be to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. Even if the fraud attempt doesn't involve the Internet directly, they maintain a database of fraud patterns that helps them identify organized operations." She clicked to the next slide, which showed additional contact information. "You should also contact your county clerk's office and ask them to place a fraud alert on your property records. This won't prevent fraudulent documents from being filed, but it will ensure that you receive immediate notification if anyone attempts to file documents related to your property." Some counties also offer enhanced monitoring services for property owners who have reason to believe they may be targeted for fraud. The practical nature of these recommendations seemed to be restoring some sense of agency to the audience. Instead of being passive victims waiting for criminals to target them, they could take concrete steps to monitor their situation and respond quickly if problems developed. Margaret advanced to a slide showing a photograph of a well-organized filing cabinet. "One of the most important protection strategies is maintaining comprehensive documentation of your property ownership," she said. You should have copies of your original deed, mortgage documents, property tax records, homeowners insurance policies, and any other paperwork related to your property. Ownership. Keep these documents in a secure location. A bank safety deposit box is ideal, and make sure at least one trusted family member or friend knows where to find them. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a sample property ownership portfolio organized in a 3-ring binder. Consider creating a property ownership portfolio that includes not just the legal documents, but also photographs of your property, records of major improvements or repairs, correspondence with insurance companies, and documentation of any disputes or issues you've had with neighbors or municipal agencies. This comprehensive documentation can be invaluable if you ever need to prove your ownership rights in court. A woman in the front row raised her hand. "What about our families?" she asked. "Should we be involving our children or other relatives in monitoring our property records?" Margaret nodded emphatically. "Family involvement is one of the most effective protection strategies," she said, "but it needs to be handled carefully to avoid creating new vulnerabilities. The ideal approach is to designate 1 or 2 trusted family members as your property monitoring team, give them access to your online property records, and establish regular communication about any unusual activity or suspicious contacts you receive." She advanced to a slide showing a sample family communication plan. "The key is creating a system where your family members are involved enough to notice problems quickly, but not so involved that they become targets for fraud themselves. For example, you might arrange for a family member to check your property records online once a month and call you immediately if they notice any unusual activity. You should also make sure your family members know about your property value, mortgage status, and plans for the property so they can recognize fraud attempts that contradict your actual situation." Harold spoke up again from his seat. "I want to tell them about the emotional part," he said, "about what this does to you as a person." Margaret handed him the microphone, recognizing that Harold's personal testimony was probably more powerful than any statistics or technical information she could provide. "When I first learned that someone had stolen my house," Harold said, his voice quiet but clear, "I thought the worst part would be the financial loss or the legal complications. But what I didn't expect was how it would make me feel about everything else in my life. If someone could steal my house with fake paperwork, what else wasn't as secure as I thought it was? My bank accounts, my Social Security benefits, my medical records. Suddenly, everything felt vulnerable." He paused, and Margaret could see that several people in the audience were nodding in recognition. "I started checking my mail obsessively, calling my bank every few days to verify my account balances, asking my neighbors if they had seen any suspicious activity around my house. I couldn't sleep properly because I kept wondering what other surprises were waiting for me. The property theft had shaken my confidence in all the systems that I had always trusted to protect me." The psychological impact of deed fraud was something that Margaret had observed in many of her clients, but Harold was articulating it more clearly than she had ever heard it expressed. The crime violated not just property rights, but the victim's fundamental sense of security and predictability in the world. "The other thing I didn't expect," Harold continued, "was how isolated it would make me feel. When I tried to explain to friends what had happened, some of them looked at me like I was confused or making it up. The whole thing sounds so outlandish that people who haven't experienced it have trouble believing it's real. I started avoiding social situations because I got tired of seeing that look in people's eyes when I tried to explain why I was spending all my time in lawyers' offices instead of enjoying my retirement." Margaret had seen this social isolation in many deed fraud victims. The crime was so unusual and the legal process so complex that victims often struggled to maintain normal relationships while dealing with the aftermath. Friends and family members who meant well often provided advice that was irrelevant or counterproductive, leading victims to withdraw rather than constantly explain their situation. "But the support group has helped," Harold said, his voice growing stronger. "When you're sitting in a room with other people who have been through exactly the same thing, you don't have to explain why you check your property records online every morning, or why you get nervous when someone knocks on your door unexpectedly. Everyone understands, and everyone is dealing with the same combination of anger, fear, and frustration." Margaret took the microphone back and clicked to a slide showing contact information for victim. Support resources. Harold's point about the emotional impact is crucial, she said. Deed fraud creates trauma that goes far beyond the financial loss, and recovering from that trauma often requires professional support. Many communities now have counseling services specifically designed for fraud victims, and there are support groups both online and in person for people dealing with property theft. She advanced to the next slide, which showed statistics about the long-term effects of fraud on elderly victims. Research shows that elderly people who experience major fraud often suffer lasting health effects, including depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and even increased risk of physical health problems. This isn't weakness or overreaction. It's a normal response to having your fundamental sense of security violated. Getting appropriate support isn't just helpful for emotional recovery, it's essential for maintaining your overall health and well-being. The room was quieter now as people absorbed not just the practical information about deed fraud, but the emotional reality of what it meant to be victimized by this crime. Margaret could see that many people were thinking about their own vulnerabilities, their own support systems, their own preparedness for dealing with a crisis that could shatter their assumptions about security and stability. "I want to end our time together by talking about something positive," Margaret said, "because despite everything I've told you about the scope and sophistication of deed fraud, there are reasons for hope." She clicked to a slide showing newspaper headlines about successful prosecutions, legislative reforms, and new protection measures being implemented by various government agencies. "Law enforcement is becoming much more sophisticated in their approach to deed fraud," she said. "The FBI has created specialized units that focus specifically on property theft schemes, and they're working closely with state and local authorities to coordinate investigations across multiple jurisdictions. Operation Stolen Foundation was just the beginning. There are similar investigations underway in at least 12 other states." She advanced to the next slide, showing information about new legislation being considered by Congress and various state legislatures. "Lawmakers are also beginning to address the regulatory gaps that make deed fraud possible," Margaret said. "Proposed legislation would require additional verification steps for property transfers involving elderly owners, create mandatory waiting periods for certain types of deed filings, and establish federal penalties for property theft crimes that cross state lines." The next slide showed information about technological solutions being developed by private companies and government agencies. Several companies are now offering blockchain-based property registration systems that would make it virtually impossible to file fraudulent deed transfers, Margaret said. "These systems create permanent, tamper-proof records of property ownership that can't be altered without the knowledge and consent of all parties involved. While these systems aren't widely available yet, pilot programs are showing promising results." She clicked to a slide showing contact information for property monitoring services specifically designed for seniors. "The private sector is also responding to the deed fraud crisis," she said. "There are now multiple companies offering comprehensive property monitoring services specifically designed for elderly property owners. These services combine regular monitoring of public records with identity theft protection, mail redirection alerts, and even physical property inspections to ensure that your home and your ownership rights are secure." Margaret looked out at the audience and could see that the combination of practical advice and information about ongoing solutions had helped restore some sense of hope and agency. People were taking notes more actively, asking questions about specific services, and discussing the information with their neighbors. "But the most important protection you have," she said, "is your own awareness and vigilance. The fraudsters count on people not paying attention to their property records, not monitoring their personal information, not asking questions when something seems unusual. By staying informed, staying alert, and staying connected with your community, you make yourself a much less attractive target for these crimes." She advanced to the final slide, which showed a summary of the key protection strategies they had discussed. "Monitor your property records regularly. Sign up for address change alerts with the Postal Service. Use identity monitoring services. Maintain comprehensive documentation of your property ownership. Stay connected with family members who can help you monitor for unusual activity. Report suspicious contacts to law enforcement immediately. And remember that you're not alone. There are resources available to help you protect yourself and to support you if you become a victim of fraud. Harold stood up one final time and took the microphone. "I want to say something to everyone here," he said, his voice carrying new strength and determination. 6 months ago, I was angry and scared and felt helpless about what had happened to me. Today, I'm still angry, but I'm not scared anymore, and I definitely don't feel helpless. I've learned that knowledge is power, that community is strength, and that we don't have to be victims. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. If you take nothing else from today, take this. You are not powerless. You can protect yourself, you can help protect your neighbors. And if something does happen to you, you can fight back and you can win. Don't let fear paralyze you, and don't let anyone convince you that you're too old or too trusting or too confused to understand what's happening around you. You're smart enough to be here today, which means you're smart enough to protect yourself. The applause that erupted from the audience was sustained and heartfelt. Not just recognition of Harold's courage in sharing his story, but affirmation of their own determination to protect themselves and their communities from the predators who sought to exploit their vulnerability. Margaret waited for the applause to subside before concluding her presentation. "Harold is absolutely right," she said. "You are not powerless, and you are not alone. The criminals who commit deed fraud depend on their victims feeling isolated and overwhelmed. By coming together, sharing information, and supporting each other, you're already defeating their most important weapon." She clicked to a slide showing contact information for her law office, the Stolen Homes Support Group, and various protection services they had discussed. "I want to leave you with my contact information and information about resources available to help you protect yourself and your property," she said. "Don't hesitate to call if you have questions, if you notice suspicious activity, or if you just need someone to explain a document or situation that seems confusing." As the formal presentation ended, Margaret noticed that instead of the usual rush toward the exit that characterized most community meetings, people were lingering, forming small groups to discuss what they had learned, exchanging phone numbers and contact information. Several people approached Harold to thank him for sharing his story and to ask about joining the support group. The transformation in the room was remarkable. People who had entered the community center that morning as isolated individuals, unaware of the threats they faced and unprepared to protect themselves, were leaving as members of an informed community with the knowledge and resources they needed to defend their most valuable assets. Margaret began packing up her presentation materials, but she was interrupted by a steady stream of questions from audience members who wanted clarification about specific protection strategies, information about legal resources, or advice about suspicious contacts they had already received. Each conversation reinforced her belief that education and community awareness were the most powerful weapons against the sophisticated criminal operations that threatened elderly property owners. As the last of the audience members filed out of the community center, Margaret reflected on the morning's presentation. The information she had shared was difficult and frightening, but it was also empowering. Knowledge of the threat was the first step toward protection, and community solidarity was the foundation of effective defense. The deed fraud epidemic was real, sophisticated, and growing, but it was not unstoppable. Every person who learned to monitor their property records, every family that created a communication plan for fraud prevention, every community that organized education and support programs, was striking a blow against the criminals who sought to prey on the vulnerability of elderly property owners. Margaret Thornton gathered her materials and walked out into the October afternoon, knowing that her work was far from finished. There were more presentations to give, more communities to educate, more victims to support in their fight for justice. But she also knew that she was not fighting alone, and that every person who walked out of that community center armed with knowledge and determination was now an ally in the battle to protect the homes and dreams of America's seniors. The war against deed fraud would be won not by law enforcement or legislation alone, but by the collective vigilance and mutual support of the communities it threatened. Today, in a modest community center in suburban Chicago, 47 more soldiers had joined that fight. Tomorrow, Margaret would stand before another group of seniors in another community center, and the fight would continue. Property owners beware indeed, but more importantly, property owners be prepared, be informed, and be united in defense of the security and dignity that homeownership represents in the American dream. The predators counted on fear and isolation to succeed in their crimes. Knowledge and community would be their downfall.